Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in Game 8 of the match of the century, 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Spassky. Bobby Fischer lost the first two games of this series. Second game actually forfeited, but since he's been on a tear, he's won 3 of the last 5. The other 2 they did tie. So Bobby Fischer is up 1 game in the series. Coming here to Game 8, Bobby Fischer is playing the white pieces. So we'll go ahead and get started. Bobby Fischer starts out with pawn to c4. Now, he played c4 just a few games ago, which is pretty uncommon for Bobby Fischer. He's pretty much well known for pawn to e4, and usually doesn't play pawn to c4 ever at all. Now, he did transpose into the Queen's Gambit decline line earlier, but in this particular game, he decides to go and just go full-blown English opening. We see pawn c4, pawn c5, knight c3, knight c6, and we start getting into the English symmetrical, meaning that Spassky's just going to mirror the moves from Bobby Fischer. You don't see this as much in high-level play anymore. I really only see it when I play my friends, and the goal is to see how long we can mirror our opponent's moves until someone does something really bad. And the goal for white specifically is try to find out which moves you can try to make your opponent match, and then that will actually destroy the game for them. If you haven't played it before, it's actually pretty fun. We get through a few more moves after pawn to g3, pawn g6, Fianchetto on the king's side, castle, pawn to d4, and then Spassky on the 7th move decides, okay, I've had enough, I don't want to mirror you moves anymore, and decides to go ahead and take here on d4. We start to see some exchanges on board. Bobby Fischer takes knight on d4, Spassky responds, knight takes on d4, queen takes on d4, pawn to d6, and then bishop g5, and Bobby Fischer completes his development. Now, bishop to e6, just getting more pieces involved into the action after the queen moves, but Spassky will also complete development. Bobby Fischer brings his queen over to f4. A very interesting move, bringing your queen over here. He had some other options. Bishop just takes on b7, seems logical. Rook b8, bishop back here f3. We could see pawn h6 if he wanted to. He's going to need to get that back material if he wanted to after the bishop moves. Could come back down here to b2, unless bishop comes back here if he really wanted to. Don't know if he would actually do that. Instead, you could just take right away. Rook takes on b2, queen takes here on a7. You could have the bishop down, take on c4. So lots of different options, but instead Bobby Fischer goes for a little bit unorthodox move with queen to f4. A queen down here, a5, putting a little pressure on the knight. A rook over here, c1, so can push a little forward, connect these pawns, and still have protection on this knight right here. Rook b8, pawn here to b3, as we talked about, and then rook over here to c8. So both sides just getting their piece a little bit more involved into the action. Rook over here on c8, controlling the semi-open file. Always a good thing to do. And then the queen comes back here to d2, allowing for a discovered attack on the queen here later on into the game. So anytime you have your queens looking each other up with a piece in the middle, you always have to keep an eye on that. We do see pawn to a6, and then bishop to e3. And bishop to e3 is an interesting move because it pretty much tells Spassky exactly what Bobby Fischer is trying to do. He's trying to bring his bishop, and he's trying to bring it here to a7, because if this rook has to move, then all of a sudden this pawn is going to be vulnerable with this bishop here on g2. Now, with that said, Spassky looked at this and said, I'm going to play pawn to b5. Now, this is just a little bit weird because it doesn't really stop the bishop coming here to a7. And not only that, but yes, the pawn won't fall now, but if the rook moves to a8, it's now vulnerable to the bishop from g2. So Bobby Fischer immediately plays bishop to a7, attacking the rook. If we come back here and say, well, what other options did he have? He had a few options. Most logically, we just say bishop to b6. This does stop it right away. Can't come here, take. The rook's going to take it if he wanted to. Could even have rook to e8. This does open up the door if the bishop were to come here to a7 for the rook to move. Could come to c8 if he wanted to. d8 has some options there. But all in all, decided to go ahead and play what I would say is a fairly bad move, unless he has some compensation afterwards, with pawn to b5. And then after Bobby Fischer plays bishop to a7, we see the pawn take on c4. Okay, that's completely okay with Bobby Fischer. He's going to go ahead and take the rook here on b8. And then after the rook takes, the pawn takes, after the bishop takes, then a rook over here to d1. So, all in all, Bobby Fischer up a pawn in this position right here, but he's adding a lot of pressure on the board. He still has that discovered attack if he ever plays knight to d5. That's going to be pretty deadly. Has to definitely watch out for that. And he's controlling the center of the board with these rooks very, very nicely. He has the fully open file, c-file with his rook, and the semi-open file in the center of the board, which is going to be very, very powerful with his queen and his rook here on d1. Also, Spassky has to be aware of this light square bishop controlling this long diagonal. Bobby Fischer, very well known for controlling the light diagonal from both sides of the board. Sometimes he'd bring his bishop over here to a2 and kind of control this, but on the other side, when he fianchettos to the king side, definitely well known for kind of sneaky attacks, controlling this long center diagonal. Now from here, Spassky goes a pretty interesting route. He had some options here. Bishop e6 makes a lot of sense. Does not want to get blown out by knight to d5. Nice little protection from that, but instead decides to play knight to d7. And I'm just not sure that he saw, or maybe he did and just didn't care, but the knight to d5. Discovered attack on the queen really has to deal with that. He would like to just take his bishop here, but after the queen takes, then all of a sudden the rook is still dominating the center file. So if we start to see exchange on board, there's really nothing else that Spassky can do besides take this queen right here. But knight takes on e7. That's going to be the extra pawn he's going to get in this position. Check. The king is forced to move. So a little in-between move before the queen falls. After king to f8, we see rook on d2 capture. After the king takes, then the rook comes up here to c4. And Bobby Fischer is now up 2 pawns in material. Anytime you're going to give 2 pawns to your opponent, you really need to come out with a really strong attack, some sort of big combination that your opponent's not really going to be able to deal with, or maybe you get into the end game with just better pieces on board. But Spassky does not have that. You can even see his pieces are somewhat passive behind. His king on e7, yeah, he can get that involved into the action, but he doesn't really have any strong attacks. He has an isolated pawn here on the d file. The pawn structure for Bobby Fischer is probably even a little bit stronger, and 2 rooks getting into the end game is going to be very, very difficult for Spassky to deal with. Spassky decides to start with a rook down here to b1, check, bishop down here, f1, protection, knight to c5, outpost move, king to g2, pawn on a5, starting to push on the king side, or queen side, trying to do something on board, pawn to e4. I think it's somewhat funny that Bobby Fischer waits till the 26th move to actually play pawn to e4. Had a few options to play it earlier on game, even if it was just pawn to e3, but he wanted to wait. Since he always starts out with pawn to e4, waiting this late in the game I think is just funny. Bishop down here to a1. I think this is a completely wasted move by Spassky. You want your bishop to control a lot of the board. He was already controlling this long diagonal right here, bringing it from g7 down here to a1. You're not really cutting off any squares. Definitely not controlling any more of the board. I don't know that Bobby Fischer was really looking to do anything that this stops on board. So it's kind of weird. Bobby Fischer says, okay, I'll just kind of let you do your thing over here. Pawn to f4, pushing on the king side. Pawn f6, rook over here, e2, just getting it behind the pawn so you can push forward with more protection. King e6, rook to c2, just adding more pressure on some of these critical squares. Also, anytime you can just get your rooks connected, it's going to be a good thing. Now, he may not want to take right away because he doesn't want to give up material. Definitely not going to exchange a rook for a knight, but later on he could have a nice little combo. Bishop here to b2. Just looks like Spassky has no idea how or where he's going to be moving his pieces. Bishop e2, h5, rook here to d2. And then after bishop to a3, we see pawn to f5. And this is a really nice deflection. And he's actually deflecting against h5. This is a very critical square on board. Bobby Fischer, yes, he is up in material, but really needs to find the end game. But Spassky is doing a good job blocking off a lot of the ways that Bobby Fischer is going to get past enemy lines here with the knight here, the outpost with the king protection right here. The way for victory is a very, very long endgame, or Bobby Fischer can blow up the king side of the board, push his pawns past, promote one of these to a queen, and win the game very easily. That's exactly what pawn to f5 does, because it takes away the protection that the square here on h5 has. If the pawn pushes forward, great, the bishop can just take here on h5. If we see here, pawn takes here on f5, great, this is exactly what Bobby Fischer wants. He can later on just take bishop here on h5 and then start to push his pawns. Can't really protect it much more, especially when you have two rooks. You can easily just swing your rook over here. Later on, if you had to, you can get your other rook involved into the game. There's just no way for Spassky to really defend this. Does decide to play a king to e5. It's just a blowout if he decides to go and take this. King takes here on f5, and then we see rook takes the knight. After the pawn takes, then we have a fork. Bishop to d3. And after the king moves, the bishop comes back here, b1, and this is just complete annihilation. So decides to draw it out a little bit further, and instead of taking, he plays king down to e5, rook to d4, just doubling up with his rooks, getting ready to take material right here. After the king takes, rook up here to d5, and then we see rook up to d6, check a wall, taking material. And then after king to e7, we have rook to c6, and Spassky decides to go ahead and resign. There's no way for him to really stop the attack that Bobby Fischer has. One of the next few moves, bishop to h5, starting to push forward if he wants to. The combination of the two rooks and the bishop is just going to be too much. So Spassky decides to go ahead and resign. So Bobby Fischer just been on a tear. He loses game one, he forfeits game two because he's kind of a crybaby, and then after that he's won 4 of the last 6, and Spassky seems to have no answer for Bobby Fischer. So all in all, I think he played a pretty poor game. That is Spassky we're talking about for game 8. The English symmetrical I don't think is his strong suit. He's never going to be the aggressor, never going to be putting Bobby Fischer in any tough lines. You're just copying your opponent's move, waiting for them to do something. So Bobby Fischer doesn't play much c4, but so far in this tournament, he has done extremely well. But Bobby Fischer being one of the best players of all time, especially during his generation, being one of the best, way beyond some of his other competitors, Spassky included in that argument. But all in all, Bobby Fischer, congratulations to him. Game 8, he does take a 2-game advantage going into Game 9. So hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in Game 9. Thanks for watching.